In the early morning of Thursday, April 19th, 1990, a worker pulled into the Pilot truck stop on Lancaster Road in Hebron, Ohio, near the junction of Interstate 70 and State Route 37. Around 8 a.m., they noticed something in the back of the parking lot. A body. It wasn't on the roadway or hidden deep in the woods. It was directly behind a commercial truck stop where drivers, staff, and travelers passed every day. The woman was partially nude, wearing only white underwear when she was found. There were no identification documents or personal items on her. Because of that, sheriffs on the scene had nothing to tell them who she was. Not a name, not an address, not a connection to family or friends. By the way, pausing really quick to say I am not an AI voice. And if you don't believe me, let me know in the comments what I can do next video to prove it. I just want y'all to know, let's move on. Her body was taken to the coroner's office. The medical examiner determined she had died from a beating. That finding immediately placed this case into a homicide investigation, rather than an accident or a medical emergency. Investigators measured her at about 5 feet 2 inches tall and around 115 pounds, with brown eyes and reddish-brown hair. She was estimated to be in her mid-20s to late 30s. Detailed notes taken at the time mentioned small identifying marks, a small white mole on the right side of the bridge of her nose, and a small brown mole on her right cheek. Because she could not be identified, law enforcement labeled her Jane Doe and began a long process of trying to find her name. They circulated sketches, took fingerprints, and asked the public for help. But none of those efforts brought a match. She stayed unidentified in official records and media reports throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. In the first weeks after her body was found, detectives focused on the location. The truck stop sat right next to a major interstate. They interviewed people who worked or stopped there. They checked if she might have been a traveler, a hitchhiker, or someone passing through. They asked about truck drivers, regular customers, local residents, anyone who might have seen her the night before or early that morning. But no clear lead emerged from those early interviews. That combination, a beaten woman left in a busy place and no name to go with her, is what pushed this case into the cold files. Investigators continued to hope someone would recognize her or come forward, but for many years that didn't happen. After the body was recovered, investigators moved into what should have been the most productive phase of the case, figuring out how the woman died and where it happened. The autopsy showed she had been beaten to death. Her injuries were consistent with a violent assault, not an accident, overdose, or medical episode. There was no indication she died naturally or collapsed on her own. From the start, this was treated as a homicide. What the autopsy could not determine was where the beating occurred. Investigators believed the location behind the Pilot truck stop was a dump site, not the crime scene. There were no clear signs of a prolonged struggle in that area, and the placement of her body suggested she had been brought there after she was already dead or close to death. That raised an immediate problem. If she wasn't killed there, then the most important evidence, the actual crime scene, was somewhere else entirely, possibly miles away. Police focused heavily on the location where she was found. The Pilot truck stop sat just off Interstate 70, a major east-west highway. Every day, long-haul truck drivers, local commuters, and travelers passed through. Someone could arrive, dump a body, and be gone quickly. That made it extremely difficult to narrow down suspects. Detectives interviewed truck stop employees, checked work schedules, and asked whether anyone had noticed a woman matching her description in the hours or days before she was found. They also tried to determine whether any disturbances had been reported overnight. Nothing solid came from those efforts. They also considered whether she might have been a traveler, hitchhiker, or someone transient who wouldn't be immediately missed. But there was no clear evidence she was unhoused, and nothing about her appearance suggested she had been living on the road long term. That left investigators stuck between two possibilities. Either she came through the area briefly with someone, or she was local enough to have ties that simply hadn't been connected yet. Despite fingerprinting, dental records, and public appeals, No identification surfaced. No missing person report clearly matched her description. No family came forward. Over time, the lack of a name became one of the biggest barriers in the case. Without knowing who she was, police couldn't retrace her last movements, relationships, or routines. As weeks turned into months, then years, the case lost momentum. Leads dried up. Detectives rotated off the case. New investigators reviewed the file periodically, but without new evidence or a name, there was little to push it forward. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, the woman found behind the pilot truck stop existed mostly as paperwork. Photographs, reports, preserved evidence, and a Jane Doe entry in databases. The homicide was never forgotten, but it was no longer actively moving. For more than 25 years, the case stayed frozen because investigators didn't know who the victim was. They had physical evidence, autopsy records, and documentation from the scene, but without a name, there was no clear starting point. They couldn't trace her movements. They couldn't reconstruct her last day. They couldn't ask the most basic question, who was the last person to see her alive? But that changed in the mid-2010s. Not because of a new witness or a confession, but because of boring paperwork. In 2016, a relative of a woman named Patrice Corley filed a missing person report in Louisville, Kentucky. Patrice had been gone for years. Like many long-term missing cases, the report came late. Not because no one cared, but because families don't always know when a disappearance crosses into something permanent. As part of that missing person report, DNA from a family member was collected and entered into NamUs, the national system that compares missing persons to unidentified remains. That system had grown much more effective over time, quietly holding profiles that couldn't be matched yet, waiting for the other half to appear. The unidentified woman found behind the pilot truck stop already had a DNA profile on file, all the way back from 1990. When the family DNA was added, the system flagged a match. After confirmation testing, authorities determined that the Jane Doe found in Hebron, Ohio on April 19th, 1990 was Patrice Corley, age 29. The identification was publicly announced in 2017, more than 2.5 decades after her death. For investigators, this wasn't an ending, though. It was the first real beginning the case had ever had. Once Patrice was identified, detectives finally had a life to work backward from. They could look at where she lived, who she knew, where she might have been traveling, and whether anyone had noticed her disappearance at the time. They could speak to family members with clarity instead of hypotheticals. They could ask questions that simply weren't possible when she was just Jane Doe. But the identification also exposed how much had already been lost. The official records still list her date of death as unknown. The exact location where she was beaten remains unidentified. There is no publicly named suspect, no arrest, no clear timeline explaining how Patrice went from her life to a truck stop parking lot off Interstate 70. So while the DNA match gave her her name back, and that matters, it still didn't solve the homicide. What it did was narrow the silence. Patrice Corley is no longer an unidentified woman found behind a truck stop. She is now a known victim in an unsolved murder with a name, an age, a family, and a place where she came from. The person who killed her has not been identified, but the case is no longer faceless. And now, instead of asking who she was, investigators are left with one harder question. Who did this to her? And how did they get away with it for so long? Before we get into the next case, guys, I gotta shill as a content creator. You know, if you're here and you want more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel or follow on Spotify wherever you are. Leave a like or a 5-star review, you know, leave a comment. But yeah, I would really appreciate that. You know, I love making these videos, and you know, if you can, if you want to, go ahead. But let's get into the next case. Emery Kolb was a famous Grand Canyon photographer, one of those names that's basically woven into the park's early history. He lived there for decades, and when he died in 1976, he was 95 years old. But then, a few weeks later, on February 7th, 1977, Authorities went into his boathouse on the South Rim and found something that no one was expecting to find in a dead man's storage space. Inside a canoe, hidden away, was a single human skeleton. Not a burial, not an archaeological site, just bones stored like an object. And the first impression investigators had was that this person hadn't died peacefully. The skull showed a bullet wound, and there was a bullet embedded in the right side of his skull. A forensic anthropologist later examined the remains and said he did not believe the wound was self-inflicted. That's one of those details that immediately changes the vibe of the whole situation. Because now you're not just looking at old remains, you're looking at what could be a murder that never got answered. The authorities turned the remains over to Dr. Walter Birkby, a forensic anthropologist at the Arizona State Museum who specialized in identifying human remains. Birkby examined the skeleton and concluded the person was a white male, roughly 20 to 23 years old, around 6 feet tall, described as robust with well-developed muscles, and with light brown hair. That's already a pretty specific profile for a skeleton with no name. Then there were the objects found around with the bones. Along with the skeleton, investigators had clothing and personal items. Pants, a shirt, a silver belt buckle, a dry leather shoe, and a piece of an old leather wallet. And the bullet was removed and identified as a .32 caliber projectile. The gun associated with it was described as a revolver type that began manufacturing around 1902. And those dates definitely mattered because they suggested that this wasn't a recent death at all, that the person likely died decades earlier, and possibly as far back as the 1920s. And this is where the case starts to get creepy in a very specific way, because none of this was hidden in the Grand Canyon. It was hidden in a man's boathouse. If you're being honest, there are only a few explanations that make sense here. Either Kolb found these remains at some point and kept them for a reason, or he held on to them because he didn't know what to do with them, or because at the time it didn't feel as unthinkable as it does now. But whatever the reason, the result is the same. A young man's skeleton sat stored in a canoe until after Kolb died. And once the authorities had the basic profile, young male gunshot wound, old-timey items, people immediately started trying to connect it to the most famous Grand Canyon disappearance they could think of, Glenn and Bessie Hyde, the couple who vanished on the Colorado River in 1928, and who Kolb was one of the last people to see alive. And that connection, with this kind of content, I want to point out, it didn't start as some internet theory decades later. It was so strong that in the early 1980s, articles and authorities were openly discussing whether these bones could be Glenn Hyde's. Glenn Hyde and his wife, Bessie Hyde, were already legends by the time the bones were found in Kolb's boathouse. In 1928, they vanished while attempting to run the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon on what was supposed to be a honeymoon adventure. Glenn was 29, Bessie was 22, and the trip was risky even by the standards of experienced river runners. Their disappearance was never solved and their bodies never recovered. And again, Emery Kolb was one of the last people to see Glenn and Bessie alive. After setting a record by reaching Bright Angel Creek in just 26 days, Glenn and Bessie hiked up to the South Rim and spent time in the Grand Canyon Village. While there, they visited Kolb, who had already run the river twice and knew the dangers better than almost anyone. Kolb photographed them at the rim, and those photos still exist, look. And according to people who knew him, he was deeply uneasy about them continuing. Accounts from Kolb's friend Thelma Self said he tried repeatedly to stop them. He warned them that the worst rapids were still ahead. He offered them life jackets, an inner tube, and even asked them to stay with him through the winter. Glenn refused all of it. He insisted they would finish the trip their way without safety gear. And there's a quote attributed to Glenn that sticks with people still. "I'm going to do it without or else." On November 16th, 1928, Kolb's wife and daughter drove the couple back down to the river. Before leaving, Bessie reportedly looked at Kolb's daughter's shoes and said, "I wonder if I shall ever wear pretty shoes again." It's one of those lines that feels too on the nose, but it is in the record and it's unsettling. Glenn and Bessie continued downriver, briefly traveling with another adventurer, Adolf Sutro, before separating. After November 18th, they were never seen again. When they failed to reach Needles, California by December 9th, a massive search began. Glenn's father, Roland Hyde, organized river parties, hired Native American trackers to search the rim, and even convinced the Secretary of War to authorize an aerial search of the canyon, something almost unheard of at the time. On December 19th, Army pilots spotted the couple's boat wedged among rocks near the lower end of the canyon. When Kolb himself reached it on December 24th, what he found only deepened the mystery. The boat was upright, largely undamaged, with 1 foot of water inside. Their clothes, boots, food, camera with exposed film, rifle, guidebook, and Bessie's diary were all still there, strapped in and organized. Everything was present except Glenn and Bessie. Bessie's final diary entry was dated November 30th, stating they had cleared a major rapid and were ahead of schedule. Notches carved into the boat matched the number of days traveled. The final photograph on their camera was taken around November 27th. Evidence suggested they made it to at least River Mile 225 or 226 before vanishing. The official belief at the time was that they drowned, possibly after hitting submerged rocks near River Mile 232, where other boats had been damaged before. But Kolb had his own theory, that one of them fell into the river while scouting a rapid, and the other jumped in to try and save them. Roland Hyde believed they may have tried to hike out of the canyon and died somewhere unseen. No bodies were ever found. So when a young man's skeleton with a gunshot wound turned up decades later in Kolb's own boathouse, people couldn't help making the leap. The timeline fit, the location fit, and the emotional weight of the Hyde disappearance was already enormous. By the early 1980s, newspapers and authorities were openly suggesting the bones might belong to Glenn Hyde. But suggestion isn't proof. And this is where the case finally took a turn that I actually respect, because instead of letting it become pure legend, someone finally tried to test it scientifically. And this, of course, goes back to Birkby, the man who looked at the body. If you remember, he said that the guy must have been somewhere between 20 and 23 years old. And that detail alone created a quiet problem. Glenn Hyde was 29 when he disappeared. That's not an impossible discrepancy, but it wasn't a clean fit either. And more importantly, the skull told a different story. If you remember again, there was a .32 caliber bullet embedded in the right side of the skull. And the standard theory for Glenn had always been drowning, not a gunshot. To test the theory directly, the skull was compared to known photographs of Glenn Hyde. Facial structure was measured and compared. The eye sockets, the width of the cheeks, the shape of the chin. The conclusion was unambiguous. The skull did not match Glenn Hyde. The bone structure was wrong in multiple places. Whatever did happen to Glenn, these bones were not his. That should have closed the case, but instead it opened a new one, because now investigators were left with a different question. If the skeleton wasn't Glenn Hyde, who was this young man, and why were his remains hidden in Emery Kolb's boathouse? That question sat unanswered for years. Then, decades later, something surfaced that finally explained at least part of it. In 2006, photographs and documents from the 1930s were donated to the Grand Canyon Museum collection. Among them were images of a human skeleton lying on a ledge beneath the canyon rim near Shoshin Point. A ranger report dated June 4th, 1933 described the scene in detail. A skeleton, a .32 caliber revolver near the right hand, cartridges nearby, and a bullet hole above the right temple. At the time, the death was believed to be a suicide, and the remains appeared to have been there for several years before discovery. In 2008, a cold case investigator compared those 1933 photographs to the bones and clothing found in Kolb's boathouse. They matched. The skeleton in the canoe and the skeleton photographed in 1933 were the same person. That discovery reframed everything. It suggested that Kolb hadn't been hiding evidence of the Hyde disappearance at all. At the time the skeleton was found in the canyon, Kolb was serving as a county coroner jury representative. When the remains couldn't be identified, it appears he took custody of them, likely temporarily, and over time, the bones were stored, forgotten, and left untouched for decades. The remains still have no name. And even with that explanation, one part of the story never stopped resurfacing, and I think I should bring it up really quick. In 1971, during a rafting trip through the canyon, an older woman reportedly told fellow rafters, "I'm Bessie Hyde." She claimed Glenn had become obsessed with finishing the trip, that he assaulted her, and that she stabbed him and left his body in the river before walking out of the canyon and starting over. The story was told calmly, without drama, which unsettled the people who heard it. Later, the woman was identified as Elizabeth Cutler, a former psychology professor from Ohio. Records showed she was born in 1908, was 4 inches taller than Bessie Hyde, and denied even ever telling the story. She denied knowing Glenn or Bessie at all. Some believe she fabricated the story deliberately, others thought it was coincidence layered onto a legend that had grown too large to contain itself. There's no evidence connecting Elizabeth Cutler to the Hyde disappearance beyond that single account. So this is where the case actually ends. The skeleton in Kolb's boathouse belongs to an unidentified man who died by gunshot sometime before 1933. Glenn and Bessie Hyde disappeared in 1928, their boat was found intact, and their bodies were never recovered. The two stories intersected only because of timing, proximity, and a man who happened to be present for both. And a century later, the canyon still hasn't given any of these people their answers. Tristan Brubach was born on October 3rd, 1984 in Frankfurt. He grew up in the suburbs of Höchst and Unterleiterbach, out on the western edge of the city rather than in the busy financial center people usually picture when they think Frankfurt. Höchst is a mix of old and industrial, half-timbered old town streets and the big chemical industrial park, plus a pretty major train station that brings in commuters from all over. So Tristan's world wasn't some tiny village. It was a normal working class suburb with buses, trains, apartment blocks, and kids cutting through little green areas to get to school. Tristan's home life had already been hit hard before any of this happened. His mother, Iris, died by suicide in 1995 when he was still a child. After that, his father, Bernd, raised him alone. He was an only child. People who knew him described him as shy but very street smart. He spent a lot of his free time just walking around the neighborhood, not really going anywhere in particular. He had a pet rabbit and really loved animals. Despite being reserved in most situations, he would regularly walk up to strangers who were out with their dogs and start talking to them about their pets. That's one of the details that sticks with me the most. He wasn't some reckless wild kid. And he liked animals. Like, who doesn't like animals? He went to Walter Kolb Primary School in Höchst, and later attended secondary school in Sindlingen, another suburb. Just normal kid stuff. Local schools, local walks, nothing that looks like the lead up to a notorious case when you lay it out on paper. Thursday, March 26th, 1998, was the last day of school before Easter break. Tristan went to class like usual. According to the official timeline, he was in school until about 1:30 p.m. when he was excused after complaining about back pain. And that's actually documented. A lot of people in this case think that he was skipping, but no, teachers let him go. It's documented that it was about back pain. There was just a theory that it was, about skipping. A fellow student later confirmed seeing Tristan get on a line bus headed toward Frankfurt Höchst railway station after leaving school. So we know he left legitimately, got on public transit, and started moving in the direction of the big local station, the kind of place everyone in that area passes through at some point. Between 2 p.m. and 2:20 p.m., another friend saw him again, still on public transport. The friend was sitting on a different bus and tried to get Tristan's attention, but Tristan didn't notice him. The friend got off at the next stop and walked to Hulk Station to try and meet up with him in person. When he couldn't find Tristan there, he eventually just went home. Sometime between 2:15 p.m. and 2:25 p.m., a student walking home saw Tristan sitting alone on a bench at the station. No struggle, no strange adults, nothing clearly true crime yet, just a boy on a bench. That puts him clearly in the Hulk Station area mid-afternoon on a day when a lot of kids were probably already in holiday mode. The last normal interaction we know about happens a bit later. At around 3:20 p.m., a woman sitting on a bench in the small park area in front of Hulk Station noticed Tristan. He sat down on the same bench by himself and smoked a cigarette. She made brief small talk with him. Nothing dramatic and no long conversation. Just that tiny slice of human contact that ends up mattering later only because of what happened next. After a short exchange, she left the bench. When she looked back, she saw two men sit down on either side of him. At that moment, there was still nothing obviously wrong from her point of view. That sighting, Tristan alive in the little park in front of Hulk Station around 3:20 p.m., casually smoking and talking to a stranger, is the last confirmed normal moment of his life. He was a shy but streetwise kid hanging around the area he knew on a busy afternoon in a neighborhood full of people in public transport. As I already mentioned, nothing about that timeline screams you're endangered the average person. He wasn't disappearing into a forest at midnight. He was moving between school, buses, and a major train station in broad daylight. At around 4 p.m., a group of children walking home from school took the shortcut a lot of local kids used. The pedestrian tunnel that runs alongside the underground section of the Leiterbach River, just west of Frankfurt Hulk Station. Locals just called it the Leiterbach Tunnel. Also, I apologize to any German viewers. I am bad at pronunciation. I looked up a few of these. I'm trying my best, I promise. Anyway, back to the tunnel. Inside, they saw a body. They didn't go over and investigate. They were kids, it was dim, and whatever they saw was disturbing enough that they turned around, went back to their school, and told their teachers. The teachers then went with them to the tunnel, saw what was actually there, and called police. The call to police came in at 5:08 p.m. The body was Tristan Brubach. The crime scene later was described by investigators as one of the worst they'd seen in Frankfurt, even in post-war Germany. And I think that's important to say up front, because otherwise it's easy to treat the details like just another list. From reconstruction work, police believe Tristan was ambushed near the southern entrance of the tunnel, close to Leiterbach itself. Sometime after being seen alive in the park at 3:20, he walked west toward the tunnel. The attacker struck him outside, not deep inside the tunnel. He was beaten in the face, then put into some kind of stranglehold and choked until he lost consciousness. After that, his attacker cut his throat. The neck wound was so deep that it reached the spinal cord, described in reports as almost a decapitation. Tristan was left to bleed out at the river. Evidence at the scene suggested that at least one of Tristan's shoes came off during the struggle outside the tunnel. Investigators believe the attacker left the scene, recovered the shoe, then came back and placed it on top of Tristan's body later. It's a small specific detail, but it shows the killer was moving in and out of the area instead of just attacking and running. After Tristan was dead, his body was dragged into the tunnel. Inside, the killer carried out the mutilation. Parts of skin and muscle tissue from Tristan's buttocks and thighs were removed with what investigators have called precise knife cuts. This case is fucked up. Can I say that? Testicles were removed. Some of the removed tissue was left placed in the tunnel itself. This is horrible. The murder weapon, a knife, was found on a concrete block nearby. Police estimate that the murder and mutilation together took less than 15 minutes. And there's another layer that makes all of this worse. During that window, 3 teenagers walked past the tunnel and saw a man bent over something inside. They later told police they believed he was maybe tying his shoe or messing with an object. They didn't understand that they were looking at an active crime scene. They kept going. Only later, when they learned what had happened, did they realize what they'd seen. Those 3 are not the same kids who found the body later. They were a separate group, passing at the wrong time. Their description of the man helped police start building an image of the suspect suspect, but in that moment, it was just another anonymous adult in the tunnel. The other key witness wasn't at the station, she was already near the tunnel. According to case files, a 12-year-old girl walked through the Leiterbach tunnel at around 3:50 p.m., roughly half an hour after the murder, depending on which reconstruction you use. She was alone. As she passed the southern entrance, she saw a man come out from behind some bushes. He wore a cap and a ponytail stuck out from the back of it. She also noticed something else, an obvious issue with his upper lip, either a cleft lip or a large scar. She didn't see Tristan, she didn't see the attack, but between her sighting and the teenagers in the tunnel, investigators ended up with 2 snapshots of a man moving around the exact area where Tristan had just been killed and dragged. Once that first shock of the crime scene wore off, the investigation narrowed around one image: a young man with a ponytail and a damaged upper lip. Multiple witnesses described some version of the same guy. Early adulthood, 20 to 30 years old, scruffy, with either a cleft lip or a big scar on his upper lip, and long hair tied back under a cap. A composite sketch was built from those statements. That sketch was then pushed out not just through local media, but shared with law enforcement worldwide. And still, not a single confirmed match has ever come back. The 12-year-old girl you heard about in part 2 is the one who saw him coming out from the bushes near the tunnel, ponytail hanging out from his cap. Other witnesses tied him to the tunnel area and, in at least one case, to Tristan himself in the days before the murder. There were even claims from former prison staff that a man matching the sketch had served time at Höchst prison, which triggered a massive check of inmate records across Germany. But every time police chased that ponytailed face into something concrete, it dissolved. And under all of that, there was one piece of physical evidence that should have blown the case open: a bloody fingerprint left near Tristan's body and/or belongings at the scene. That print has never matched anyone. Almost a year after the murder, in March 1999, Tristan's rucksack turned up in a forest about 25 kilometers from the Leiterbach tunnel. If it hadn't been dumped around the station or in the city, someone had taken it out of Frankfurt and left it in a wooded area off a rural footpath. Inside the backpack, investigators found something that clearly wasn't Tristan's: a Czech language road atlas of Germany. Tristan didn't speak Czech, didn't have connections to the Czech Republic, and had no realistic reason to own that book. Police treated it as a potential clue about the killer instead. They pushed the case and the sketch into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, working with authorities there, looking for anyone who might recognize the face or the atlas link. Nothing real came back from that either. I think this is one of those details where you can feel how close they thought they were. A backpack, a foreign language atlas, a specific forest, and then it just doesn't go anywhere. In 2002, investigators launched one of the largest mass fingerprinting operations Germany had ever seen. All males aged 15 to 45 in Höchst and the other place, Unter Leiterbach, plus regular male commuters in that age range who used Frankfurt Höchst station, were asked to give fingerprints voluntarily. By 2014, more than 98% of the men in that bracket from Höchst and over 92% from Unter Leiterbach had been printed. Still no match for the bloody fingerprint from the crime scene. In total, police have followed over 23,000 leads, worked with Interpol and the FBI, and repeatedly re-reviewed the case. The scale of the file is ridiculous, and in a way that's part of the horror. You can't say they didn't try. Then, in 2016, a name hit the news: Manfred Seal. Seal was a suspected serial killer linked to multiple murders of women in Hesse between the 1970s and 2000s. After his death, remains and disturbing writings were found among his belongings. Because he lived in the general area and showed sexual sadism with mutilation of that area in other cases, he was briefly examined as a potential suspect in Tristan's murder. But the fit was bad from the start. Wrong victim profile, wrong age, and when investigations compared Seal's fingerprints with the bloody fingerprint from Tristan's scene, they didn't match. In October 2017, police publicly excluded Seal as Tristan's killer. On April 7th, 1998, the day after Tristan's funeral, a man called the police and said he was the murderer. He claimed he was at Frankfurt Hulk Station and told them to come arrest him. He described himself as about 180 centimeters tall, with long black hair. Officers rushed to the station. By the time they arrived, he was gone. The caller has never been identified, and parts of the call have been released publicly, but it's never led to him. And if my editor can find any of those parts, please put them here.
Polizei? Christian Mörder. Wie bitte? Christian Mörder ist hier. Sind Sie? Ja. Und Sie wollen sich selber stellen, oder was? Ja. Ja? Wo sind Sie denn jetzt? Frankfurt Höchst. Frankfurt Höchst? Ja, und wo dort? Am Höchstbahnhof. Am Bahnhof? Ja. Umgebracht. Sie haben ihn umgebracht? Ja. Wie sehen Sie denn aus? Wie groß? 1,80. 1,80. Haare? Schwarze. Schwarze Haare. Lange oder kurz? Lange. Lange Haare.
In October 1999, someone slipped into Hulk's cemetery at night and dug down into Tristan's grave. They excavated about 1.2 meters all the way down to the coffin and stopped. The coffin wasn't opened and nothing was taken. Police have said they believe it was likely the act of a mentally disturbed person rather than the killer returning. Under German law, public graves are only maintained for a set period, about 20 years in Hesse. After that, the family has to pay to extend the lease or the grave is reused. Tristan's father died in 2015 and there was no one left who could afford to keep up the grave, so the plot was eventually reused. In March 2018, after his original grave was cleared, a memorial stone for Tristan was placed under a nearby tree in sight of where he had once been buried. His grandmother had earlier insisted that his grave cross read not deceased, but murdered 1998. The memorial continues that same blunt honesty. This isn't just a boy who died, this is a boy who was killed, and nobody is paid for it. And that's the end of the video, guys. Thanks for watching this whole way through. I had a great time with this one. I mean, not because, the cases are scary, so I didn't have a great time, but it's interesting. Thank you for listening and watching so far. I hope you all have a great night. Sweet dreams.